The eunuch at once passed into the princess's room, and handing her the letter said, "Madam, a new astrologer has arrived, who declares that you will be cured as soon as you have read this letter and seen what it contains." The princess took the note and opened it with languid indifference. But no sooner did she see her ring than, barely glancing at the writing, she rose hastily and with one bound reached the doorway and pushed back the hangings. Here she and the prince recognized each other, and in a moment they were locked in each other's arms. They tenderly embraced, wondering how they came to meet at last after so long a separation. The nurse, who had hastened after her charge, drew them back into the inner room, where the princess restored her ring to Camaralzaman. "Take it back," she said. "I could not keep it without returning yours to you, and I am resolved to wear that as long as I live." Meanwhile, the eunuch had hastened back to the king. "Sire," he cried, "all the former doctors and astrologers were mere quacks. This man has cured the princess without even seeing her." He then told all to the king, who, overjoyed, hastened to his daughter's apartments, where after embracing her, he placed her hand in that of the prince, saying, "Happy stranger, I keep my promise and give you my daughter to wife, be you who you may. But if I am not much mistaken, your condition is above what you appear to be." The prince thanked the king in the warmest and most respectful terms, and said, "As regards my person, your majesty has rightly guessed that I am not an astrologer. It is but a disguise which I assumed in order to merit your illustrious alliance. I myself am a prince. My name is Camaralzaman, and my father is Shahzaman, king of the Isles of the Children of the Khaladan." He then told his whole history, including the extraordinary manner of his first seeing and loving the Princess Badoura. When he had finished, the king exclaimed, "So remarkable a story must not be lost to posterity. It shall be inscribed in the archives of my kingdom and published everywhere abroad." The wedding took place next day amidst great pomp and rejoicing. Marzavan was not forgotten, but given a lucrative post at court, with a promise of further advancement. The prince and princess were now entirely happy, and months slipped by in the enjoyment of each other's society. One night, however, Prince Camaralzaman dreamt that he saw his father lying at the point of death, and saying, "Alas! My son, whom I loved so tenderly, has deserted me and is now causing my death." The prince awoke with such a groan as to startle the princess, who asked what was the matter. "Ah!" cried the prince, "at this very moment my father is perhaps no more," and he told his dream. The princess said but little at the time, but next morning she went to the king, and kissing his hand said, "I have a favour to ask of your majesty, and I beg you to believe that it is in no way prompted by my husband. It is that you will allow us both to visit my father-in-law, King Shahzaman." Sorry though the king felt at the idea of parting with his daughter, he felt her request to be so reasonable that he could not refuse it, and made but one condition, which was that she should only spend 1 year at the court of King Shahzaman, suggesting that in future the young couple should visit their respective parents alternately. The princess brought this good news to her husband, who thanked her tenderly for this fresh proof of her affection. All preparations for the journey were now pressed forward, and when all was ready the king accompanied the travellers for some days, after which he took an affectionate leave of his daughter, and charging the prince to take every care of her, returned to his capital. The prince and princess journeyed on, and at the end of a month reached a huge meadow interspersed with clumps of big trees which cast a most pleasant shade. As the heat was great, Camaralzaman thought it well to encamp in this cool spot. Accordingly, the tents were pitched, and the princess, entering hers while the prince was giving his further orders, removed her girdle, which she placed down beside her, and desiring her women to leave her, lay down and was soon asleep. When the camp was all in order, the prince entered the tent, and seeing the princess asleep, sat down near her without speaking. His eyes fell on the girdle which he took up, and while inspecting the precious stones set in it, he noticed a little pouch sewn into the girdle and fastened by a loop. He touched it and felt something hard within. Curious as to what this might be, he opened the pouch, and he found a carnelian engraved with various figures and strange characters. "This carnelian must be something very precious," thought he, "or my wife would not wear it on her person with so much care." In truth, it was a talisman which the Queen of China had given her daughter, telling her it would ensure her happiness as long as she carried it about her. The better to examine the stone, the prince stepped to the open doorway of the tent. As he stood there holding it in the open palm of his hand, a bird suddenly swooped down, picked the stone up in its beak, and flew away with it. Imagine the prince's dismay at losing a jewel by which his wife evidently set such store. The bird, having secured its prey, flew off some yards and alighted on the ground, holding the talisman in its beak. Prince Camaralzaman advanced, hoping the bird would drop it, but as soon as he approached, the thief fluttered on a little further still. He continued his pursuit till the bird suddenly swallowed the stone and took a longer flight than before. The prince then hoped to kill it with a stone, but the more hotly he pursued, the farther flew the bird. In this fashion he was led on by hill and by dale through the entire day, and when night came the tiresome creature roosted on the top of a very high tree where it could rest in safety. The prince, in despair at all his useless trouble, began to think whether he had better return to camp. But, thought he, how shall I find my way back? Must I go uphill or down? I should certainly lose my way in the dark, even if my strength held out. Overwhelmed by hunger, thirst, fatigue, and sleep, he ended by spending the night at the foot of the tree. Next morning Camaralzaman woke up before the bird left its perch, and no sooner did it take flight than he followed it again with as little success as the previous day, only stopping to eat some herbs and fruit he found by the way. In this fashion he spent 10 days, following the bird all day and spending the night at the foot of a tree, while it roosted on the topmost bough. On the 11th day the bird and the prince reached a large town, and as soon as they were close to its walls, the bird took a sudden and higher flight, and was shortly completely out of sight. Camaralzaman felt despair at having to give up all hopes of ever recovering the talisman of the Princess Bedora. Much cast down, he entered the town, which was built near the sea and had a fine harbour. He walked about the streets for a long time, not knowing where to go, but at length he walked near the seashore and found a garden door open, and walked in. The gardener, a good old man who was at work, happened to look up, and seeing a stranger who he recognized by his dress as a Muslim, told him to come in at once and shut the door. Camaralzaman did as he was bid and inquired why this precaution was taken. Because, said the gardener, I see that you are a stranger and a Muslim, and this town is almost entirely inhabited by idolaters who hate and persecute all of our faith. It seems almost a miracle that has led you to this house, and I am indeed glad that you have found a place of safety. Camaralzaman warmly thanked the kind old man for offering him shelter, and was about to say more, but the gardener interrupted him. Leave compliments alone. You are weary and must be hungry. Come in, eat, and rest. So saying, he led the prince into his cottage, and after satisfying his hunger, begged to learn the cause of his arrival. Camaralzaman told him all without disguise, and ended by inquiring the shortest way to his father's capital. For, added he, if I tried to rejoin the princess, how should I find her after 11 days' separation? Perhaps indeed she may no longer be alive. At this terrible thought, he burst into tears. The gardener informed Camaralzaman that they were quite a year's land journey to any Mohammedan country, but there was a much shorter route by sea to the Ebony Island, from whence the Isles of the Children of the Khaladan could easily be reached, and a ship sailed once a year for the Ebony Island, by which he might get so far as his very home. If only you had arrived a few days sooner, he said, he might have embarked at once. As it is, you must now wait until next year, but if you care to stay with me, I offer you my house, such as it is, with all my heart. Prince Camaralzaman thought himself lucky to find such a place of refuge, and gladly accepted the gardener's offer. He spent his days working in the garden, and his nights thinking of and sighing for his beloved wife. Let us now see what has become of Princess Bedora. On first waking, she was much surprised not to find the prince near her. She called her women and asked if they knew where he was, and while they were telling her that they had seen him enter the tent but not noticed him leaving it, she took up her belt and perceived that the little pouch was open and the talisman was gone. She at once concluded that her husband had taken it and would shortly bring it back. She waited for him till evening, rather impatiently, and wondered what it was that could have kept him from her for so long. When night came without him, she felt in despair and abused the talisman and its maker roundly. In spite of her grief and anxiety, however, she did not lose her presence of mind, but decided on a courageous, though unusual step. Only the princess and her women knew of Camaralzaman's disappearance, for the rest of the party was sleeping or resting in their tents. Fearing some treason should the truth be known, she ordered her women not to say a word which would give rise to any suspicion, and proceeded to change her dress for one of her husbands, to whom, as has already been said, she bore a strong likeness. In this disguise she looked so much like the prince that when she gave orders the next morning to break up camp and continue the journey, no one suspected the change. She made one of her women enter her litter, while she herself mounted on horseback, and the march began. After a protracted journey by land and sea, the princess, still under the name and disguise of Prince Camaralzaman, arrived at the capital of the Ebony Isle, whose king was named Armanos. No sooner did the king hear that the ship which was just in port had on board the son of his old friend and ally, than he hurried to meet the supposed prince, and had him and his retinue brought to the palace, where they were lodged and entertained sumptuously. After 3 days, finding that his guest, to whom he had taken a great fancy, talked of continuing his journey, King Armanos said to him, "Prince, I am now an old man, and unfortunately I have no son to whom to leave my kingdom. It has pleased heaven to give me only one daughter, who possesses such great beauty and charm that I could only give her to a prince as highly born and as accomplished as yourself. Instead, therefore, of returning to your own country, take my daughter and my crown and stay with us. I will feel that I have a worthy successor, and shall cheerfully retire from the fatigues of government." The king's offer was naturally rather embarrassing to the Princess Badoura. She felt that it was equally impossible to confess that she had deceived him, or to refuse the marriage on which he had set his heart, a refusal which might turn all his kindness to hatred and persecution. All things considered, she decided to accept, and after a few moments' silence, said with a blush, which the king attributed to modesty, "Sir, I feel so great an obligation for the good opinion your Majesty has expressed for my person, and of the honour you do me, that, although I am quite unworthy of it, I dare not refuse. But, sire, I can only accept such an alliance if you give me your promise to assist me with your counsels." The marriage being thus arranged, the ceremony was fixed for the following day, and the princess employed the intervening time in informing the officers of her suite what had happened, assuring them that Princess Badoura had given her full consent to the marriage. She also told her women and bade them keep her secret well. King Armanos, delighted with the success of his plans, lost no time in assembling his court and council, to whom he presented his successor, and placing his future son-in-law on the throne, made everyone do homage, and take oaths of allegiance to the new king. At night the whole town was filled with rejoicings, and with much pomp the Princess Hayatalnefus, which was the name of the king's daughter, was conducted to the palace of Princess Badoura. Now Badoura had thought much of the difficulties of her first interview with King Armanos's daughter, and she felt the only thing to do was at once to take her into her confidence. Accordingly, as soon as they were alone, she took the king's daughter by the hand and said, "Princess, I have a secret to tell you, and I must throw myself on your mercy. I am not Prince Camaralzaman, but a princess like yourself and his wife. I beg you to listen to my story, then I am sure you will forgive my imposture in consideration of my sufferings." She then related her whole history, and at its close the king's daughter embraced her warmly and assured her of her entire sympathy and affection. The two princesses now planned out their future action, and agreed to combine to keep up the deception and to let Badoura continue to play a man's part, until such time as there might be news of the real Camaralzaman. While these things were passing in the Ebony Island, Prince Camaralzaman continued to find shelter in the gardener's cottage, in the town of the idolaters. Early one morning the gardener said to the prince, "Today is a public holiday, and the people of the town not only do not work themselves, but forbid others to do so. You had therefore better take a good rest while I go and see some friends, and as the time is near for the arrival of the ship of which I told you, I will make inquiries about it and try to bespeak a passage for you." He then put on his best clothes and went out, leaving the prince, who strolled into the garden and was soon lost in thoughts of his dear wife and their sad separation. As he walked up and down, he was suddenly disturbed in his reverie by the noise two large birds were making in a tree. Camaralzaman stood still, and looking up, saw that the birds were fighting so savagely with beaks and claws that before long one fell dead to the ground, while the conqueror spread his wings and flew away. Almost immediately 2 other larger birds, who had been watching the duel, flew up and alighted, one at the head and the other at the feet of the dead bird. They stood there some time, sadly shaking their heads, and then dug up a grave with their claws, in which they buried him. As soon as they had filled in the grave, the birds flew off, but ere long returned with the murderer, whom they held, one by a wing and the other by a leg, with their beaks. The prisoner was screaming and struggling with rage and terror, but the 2 held tight, and having brought him to his victim's grave, proceeded to kill him. Then they tore his body and scattered it, and once more flew away. The prince, who had watched the whole scene with much interest, now drew near the spot where it happened, and glancing at the dead bird, he noticed something red lying near. He picked it up, and what was his surprise when he recognized the Princess Badora's talisman, which had been the cause of his many misfortunes. It would be impossible to describe his joy. He kissed the talisman repeatedly, wrapped it up, and carefully tied it around his arm. For the first time since his separation from the princess, he had a good night, and the next morning he was up at daybreak and went cheerfully to ask what work he should do. The gardener told him to cut down an old fruit tree which had died, and as Camaralzaman took an axe and fell to vigorously. As he was hacking at one of the roots, the axe struck something hard. On pushing away the earth, he discovered a large slab of bronze, under which was disclosed a staircase with 10 steps. He went down them and found himself in a cave in which stood 50 large bronze jars, each with a cover on them. The prince uncovered one after the other and found them all filled with gold dust. Delighted with his discovery, he left the cave, replaced the slab, and having finished cutting down the tree, waited for the gardener's return. The gardener had heard the night before that the ship about which he was inquiring would start ere long, but the exact date not yet being known, he had been told to return the next day for further information. He had gone, therefore, to inquire, and came back with good news beaming in his face. "My son," he said, "rejoice and hold yourself ready to start in 3 days' time. The ship is to set sail, and I have arranged all about your passage with the captain." "You could not bring me better news," replied Camaralzaman, "and in return I have something pleasant to tell you. Follow me and see the good fortune which has befallen you." He then led the gardener to the cave, and having shown him the treasure stored up there, said how happy it made him that heaven should reward in this way his kind host's many virtues, and compensate him for the privations of many years. "What do you mean?" asked the gardener. "Do you imagine that I should appropriate this treasure? It is yours, and I have no right whatever to it. For the last 80 years I have dug up the ground here without discovering anything. It is clear that these riches are intended for you, and they are much more needed by a prince like yourself than by an old man like me, who am near my end and require nothing. This treasure comes at just the right time, when you are about to return to your own country, where you will make good use of it." The prince would not hear of this suggestion, and finally, after much discussion, they agreed to divide the gold. I think we'll leave it there. See you tomorrow.